blood transfusions in Holland. So I carried his name for 71 years. I'll carry it for at least as long as Noni has been carrying her name. And Devo has forgotten more than I will ever know about families and history. Before I tell you a little bit about my family, Vinny DeBrown and I are high school classmates. Go back at least that long. Used to get my hair cut as far as when I used to get haircuts. Back in this
The both of you are why his father never did good business.
Vinny took one of the rules that in my 60s. We have 8 Dr. Massuccos in my family, and I was the first lawyer. I was the first black sheep. I said I had to become a lawyer to keep the rest of them out of trouble. Vinny looked at the law for a little bit and then decided to go into medicine. Probably a better choice. Vinny and I played together. He still plays music. By the time I got to college, I knew I was never going to make a living at it or be any good. But our last band, along with Brian Haskell and Charlie Wilson and Mark Kennedy, and I'm not sure who else was in the band back then, but there's a reason why the band didn't continue. It was Dumpy, Dopey, and the Dirty Dogs. Dopey was Dopey Mitchell, Bush Mitchell, who was here in town. We used to practice at his house because his parents had a detached garage where we could practice. Everybody else had a garage next to the house and wouldn't let us practice. So Vinny and I got back along. The other Devo, the original Devo, brother of the last king of England, of Italy, and I worked together back in the 60s. I was working for the Village from O'Kelly, Hockey Clark, Georgie Smith, Donnie Riendo, that entire crew, and he was a beginning server. And we laid the first water and sewer pipes up on the brand new housing development known as Reese Circle at the top of Middle Drive back in the 60s. Devo was the technical guy telling me where to put the pipes. I was the kid down in the dirt in the ditch. So we both come a little ways since then. So it's our first day on the job. Mo Kelly, there, going to work, and he said, "All right, you're the new kid. You get to sweep out the town barn." I said, "Mr. Kelly," I said, "I've been a year of college." He goes, "Great, I'll show you how." My first job was cleaning the sewers. We used to pull the catch basin with a 14-foot long shovel they called a spoon. He told me I could keep anything I found. And that was before the stormwater sewer separation. So think about that for a minute. Anyway, going back to the history of our family, which predates, at least in this country, the DiBernardo son. In 1893, my grandfather, Francesco Marcellino Massucco, who was born in Lucano, Italy, on April 22nd, 1970, married Lucia Maria Tomasi, who was born on September 28th, which happens to be my sister's birthday, in 1875. They had because he was about to depart for this country, they had a civil ceremony which was not recognized in the Catholic Church. So while they were married, at least officially, they were not considered a married couple according to the church. Frank, or Francesco, or in the family, as he was known as Pavone, for the nickname, which I understand later meant grandfather or older father, something like that. He came in through the port of Boston and went right straight to Bari, where there were other native Italians from his area of Italy to work in the granite fields. Lucia, they could not afford for both of them to come. So Lucia, who was a seamstress by trade, stayed behind until she could earn her passage to come to this country. So Frank, or Francesco, landed up there in 1893. By 1896, he had moved down to Bellows Falls, either 96 or the year before, I'm never quite clear, to rent space from the Baldessaro family. We're from North Walpole. Mary Marino Barber, her grandparents were the Baldessaros. She's another classmate of Vinny's and mine. And Mary's grandparents owned that, and they rented to my grandfather. Right on the corner, later on, I owned it as the corner store. It is now where the new coffee roasters is. It's the yellow wooden building right at the head of the square. So it's been in or out of our family 3 times over the last more than 100 years. By 1896, Lucia Maria Tomasi, I just love saying that name out loud, had earned enough money to come to this country. So she let Frank know she would be arriving. She did. She came into Boston, as did he. She arrived in Bellows Falls. Frank announced, to her dismay, that his passion had cooled off, and he no longer wished to marry her for real. Well, Lucia, Maria, being newly arrived in this country, did what Americans do every day. She sued him. Well, both eyes on Lucy. Lucy, as I know her. The legal theory behind it was, in a sense, a breach of contract. It was called breach of promise to marry. He had promised to marry her. She spent money to come here to fulfill her end of the contract. And when she got here, he breached it. Not good. So anyway, they went to court, and she was awarded $368.87. Cost of her passage from the old country to the new country. Well, Frank was not going to take this lying down. He appealed it, and went all the way to the Vermont Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld it, which meant he not only had to pay it, now it was earning interest. Well, if there's anything a frugal Italian does not want to pay, it's interest. So he goes to Lucia. He says, Lucia, let's part a little poetic license. Francesco goes to Lucia and he says, Lucia, he said, I'll tell you what. He says, you drop of the soup and I'll marry you. Because Frank, having been here for 3 years, knew that his spouse could not collect from the other spouse. Women had no rights in 1896. They couldn't vote. They couldn't own property. They couldn't bring a lawsuit. But if he married her, the lawsuit goes away. Lucy, still in love with Frank, says, okay, Frank, I have dropped the soup and I marry you. Well, apparently the passion came back. They had 15 children. So if it wasn't for the great American legal system, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't get to do what I've been doing every day for the last 46 years, which is practice law in my hometown. And I love it just as much as Norwegians. Anyway, they settled. Originally, they rented the property, but eventually Frank and Lucy became very successful. They stayed in the old Baldessero block for 10 years, and as my father told me, I never knew my grandfather. Frank died in December 29th of 1927. My father was only 13 years old. He dropped out of school and went to work to help support his mother. He had older brothers and younger brothers and sisters. After about a year, his older brother said, we'll take care of Ma, you get your rear end back in school, and we'll take care of her. My grandmother lived till January 16th of 1953, so she stuck around quite a bit longer than Frank. But anyway, they rented the property from the Baldazeros for 10 years, and even though they were very successful, doing well, paid their rent on time, they were from northern Italy, up in Bacana, around Turin. The Baldazeros were from Sicily, southern Italy. My grandparents were of sufficient quality stock, standing, whatever you want to say, to be a tenant, but they really didn't think they were worthy of being landowners. So the Baldazeros would never sell to them. Mary says that's not quite the way it went, but that's my story. So after 10 years, when they couldn't buy it, they moved next door. And they bought that building, which eventually we knew as Nick's or Barbieri's over the years. So in 1906, they bought that building. My grandfather sponsored his cousin, Luciano Bertolino, to come over from this country to help him run the business. By this time, they had a number of children. Lucy was at home raising this massive crew. 5 of the children died at childbirth or shortly thereafter. They did not grow to be adults, but 10 of them did grow to be adults. So Luciano Bertolino came over, went into business with my corner store. This is back in the, I call it the corner store, but I owned it back in the 80s. But this is one that's on the corner, where the coffee roasters is now. And they've recently been doing renovations. It's actually, they've done a great job.
That's the only one we have. We have 2.
So you can just barely see it in the background. But they went literally right next door and bought that property. And from 1906 until my grandfather died in, in 27, he ran it. My grandmother continued to own the building until 1931. And in 1931, she sold it to Luciano Bertolino, the cousin who would come over, and Augusto Barbier, Gus Barbier. And Gus and his family continued to own that up until 1975. Long, long history of that. In the meantime, because his sponsor had died, Luciano, having been here for more than 25 years, married, had children, went to St. Charles, people were baptized there. Because his sponsor had died, he did not feel he could stay. He packed up the entire family because his sponsor had died. In the meantime, my grandfather had also sponsored, as I understand it, Vivo's grandfather, Joe DiMuzio's grandfather, all folks from the old country that they knew. And I don't know if you were required to have a sponsor, but I think it certainly helped to get into this country. If you had a place to land, knew you had a job, had a place to stay, that was certainly part of the program back then. So, as I say, they went on to have these property at 122 Atkinson Street, 122 and a half Atkinson Street, 3 Wells Street, 33 and 38 Laurel Avenue. They acquired quite a few rental properties and garages. And sort of an aftermath to that, when I came back home in 1972 to work for Tony Kissel, another son of immigrants, a couple years later, I was having dinner with my parents, and my father said, hey, when you get a few minutes, could you clean up Ma's estate? Ma being my grandmother Lucy, who died in 1953. This is now I've been home for a few years, so probably 74, 75, somewhere here. I said, Ma's estate? I said, Dad, she's been dead for more than 20 years. What do you mean? He said, well, the lawyer that was handling it, who was a partner with Joe Bigelow, his name was Edwards, I can't remember his first name, said, yeah, somewhere along the way he died. I'm not sure the paperwork ever got finished. So I go down to probate, I go down to town hall, start researching these records. He was right. My grandmother, been dead now for 20 odd years, still had an open estate. In the meantime, 3 more children had died. Well, so I had to reopen her estate. I had to either open or reopen 6 other probate estates in 3 different states. I had to chase down relatives that I wasn't even sure existed. Long story short, 19 years later, I finally finished the probate of all the Massucco estates, and we were able to liquidate the rest of the properties. But it took me a long, long time. Meantime, I became the de facto landlord, and I was running 20 or 25 apartments, 19 garage bays. I was doing more landlord work and running out at night to fix plumbing and everything else than I was practicing law. I'm so glad not to be a landlord anymore. But here was literally 70 years later. 70 years after they acquired properties, 20 years after she died, we were still seeing the, quote, benefits of their success in America. My father was a dentist here in town for 42 years. A few years before the war, he practiced with his brother Louis down in Westfield, Massachusetts. A few years after the war, he followed my mother, who had moved to Waterbury, Connecticut, to be with her mother. And he practiced down there. He became head of the chief of staff at Waterbury Hospital and Holy Cross Hospital down in Connecticut. We were coming up to Vermont every vacation, every holiday. He was a hunter, a fisherman. His mother was still here. His sisters were still here. At least one brother. Eventually, they said, why are we going back and forth to Bellows Falls? Why don't we just go home? And thank God for me, in the 50s they did. They came back home. Much of the family was still here. All that generation is now gone. I am actually, of this branch of the Massucco family in this country, I am now the second oldest living Massucco. I have one cousin who just turned 80, who's the only one older than I am, in that entire branch of the family. And we have lots and lots of younger ones, all of whom are scattered all over the place. I have one cousin still here in town. I have a sister in Saxon River. I have a sister in Martinsville. We're it for the local Massuccos who are still here. But it's been a great life. It's been, certainly wonderful for us. They did well. Even when we're talking about the Italians, my mother, who was Scotch and English, that side of the family, her maiden name was Bigelow. We did not get the Bigelow tea, the Bigelow silver, the Bigelow hairpins, and all that. They settled the town. My 8th great grandfather, Jonathan Bigelow, was one of the 67 original land grantees on the charter for the town of Rockingham. Signed, came through King George III via Governor Benning Wentworth of New Hampshire. It was signed on December 28, 1752. They actually arrived here, settled here with their families, along with 6 other families from Watertown, Massachusetts, and lived in Old Rockingham. Something happened early on, and they all left. I don't know if it was troubles with the natives, famine, disease, whatever, but they all left. And then they all came back in 1763. And they settled, he was in a house that's long gone, right across from the Rockingham Meeting House, which was not started to be built for another 25 years. So on that side of the family, we've been here for 265 years or something like that. My mother grew up on the Basin Farm. My grandfather sold it in 1944 to Preston Cox. So that's the first thing I see every morning. I look out my back window, the farmer she grew up, which is sort of neat. So between the 2 families, my mother being here so long, my father being a family with so many children, I tell the story that at this point, I'm either related to everybody in Bellows Falls, I've represented everybody in Bellows Falls, or I have sued everybody. I just try not to do it all at the same time. Conflicts of interest in a small town come up, as Debo can tell you, or Ellen can tell you, or anybody else, pretty much every day of the week. But we try to work it out, we try to make it work. I'm eternally grateful for being the grandchild of immigrants. They certainly made a better life for their family, and we're glad to be here, as it was. So, I've got a bunch of other materials over there if you're interested, including